Okay, welcome to CSIS virtually. Welcome to our panel today, The Future of Quantum Public-Private Collaboration for Innovation and Adoption. We were chatting a little bit beforehand, and one of the things that's leapt out to me is that the quantum future, if you want to call it that, is probably closer than we think. How close we can talk about in this panel. And it also depends on the application. But let me briefly introduce our panelists. They all have distinguished backgrounds. I'm going to provide their titles. Dustin Moody, who we've had before, thanks Dustin for coming back, is a mathematician and the lead of the Post-Quantum Cryptography Project at the National Institutes of Standards. And I noted in his bio, it says he did research on elliptic curves, which is one of the things that dragged me into this unhappily a long time ago. Celia Merzbacher is executive director of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, or QED-C. Previously, a long career, I won't read all the highlights, but at the White House, at the Semiconductor Research Consortium, a lot of work on nanotechnology and with PCAST, if you know what that is. Final speaker, Ben McCarty, senior principal at Accenture for technology research, does a lot of work on quantum, how to secure it, and has a background in cryptography and cyber warfare, which is in some ways perfect for this, with also previous long record of government experience. So as we were also saying in the lead up to this before it went public, is quantum is in some ways, quantum applications, quantum technology is probably closer than at least I thought when we started this series about a year ago. It's closer to being adopted. People are already using it. And the future is coming upon us much faster than I had at least thought. But there's been some progress. And so I wanted to start with Dustin and talk about NIST, the Post-Quantum Cryptography competition, where you had 4 selectees, and see where we are in that. So Dustin, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm glad to be here again, speaking with you. So as most of you probably know, NIST is a federal agency that sits inside the Department of Commerce, and NIST does a lot of research in a variety of scientific areas. The part that I'm in works with computer security, and more specifically looking at cryptography. And it's been well known that for a couple decades that if there was a large enough quantum computer around, that it would threaten some of the crypto that we use today to protect our information. As time goes on, we've seen progress into building larger and larger quantum computers, and we've seen headlines as organizations and governments are racing to build bigger and bigger machines that can do very nice things. There will be a lot of very positive applications with quantum technologies. But where I sit, of course, we were looking at the impact to cryptography, and specifically, it would break all of the widely used public key crypto systems that we use today. Now, there are other crypto systems that are important, and we use them as well. But at NIST, we wanted to replace our standards with these vulnerable systems with new crypto systems that would be protected against attacks from a future quantum machine. Now, one of the questions we always get is, well, why do we worry about this now? Quantum computers right now are quite small. They can't break the crypto that we use. And couple different reasons we're working on it. First, it takes time to do all the work and research and to create the standards and to start adopting new crypto systems. But second, you can actually be at risk from a quantum attack now, even though a quantum computer does not yet exist. I think it's sort of well known, this idea of harvest now, decrypt later, where your adversary could be harvesting your data and they can't read it right now because it's encrypted, but they can hold on to it until the quantum computer comes out, and then they'll get access to your data. And if that data needs to have a long, it needs to be protected for a long term, then you could be at risk now, even though quantum computer is not yet here. And we may talk about when a quantum computer will be here during this panel. Of course, nobody knows for certain, but we have estimates that somewhere 10, 15, 20 years is not out of the realm of possibility. And so because standardization takes so long, NIST began a project to prepare for this in terms of the impact to cryptography. So in 2016, 2017, we kicked off basically a large international competition to find, vet, and then standardize new crypto systems. We received a large number in response. It was a big international response from around the world. Researchers and cryptographers teamed together with some industry, and we had 69 submissions that were accepted into the first round that we could begin evaluating, both internally as well as people around the world. It could be benchmarking, could be cryptanalyzing them. And we proceeded through 3 rounds of our process, where at each round, people evaluated, we looked at new research results, and then at the end of the round, we selected the most promising ones to move on. So the third round finally concluded this summer, and we selected 4 algorithms for standardization. That includes 1 algorithm for encryption and 3 algorithms for what's called digital signatures that provides authentication. And we're excited about that. We're beginning to write the draft standards. We will put those out for public comment. We'll address the comments, and we hope to then have the standards published around 2024 for people to begin adopting those. Now, the process isn't over yet. We have some algorithms that are still being studied in a 4th round, and we're also going to call for new digital signatures that are based on different mathematical ideas than the ones we standardized. So there's going to be continued work in this standardization of post-quantum cryptographic algorithms. But nonetheless, we're excited that we finally have some algorithms here, and we'll probably talk today about other things you can do to prepare, even though we don't want you to start using these yet because they're not yet in the final form that they'll be published. But we're grateful that we'll be able to partner with so many different people to help make this important transition that will provide protection for all of us.
Dustin, let me follow up on that real quick before I turn to the others. You said you had a lot of international participation. Where was it from? And there's a country whose name begins with the letter C. Were they involved in this?
Yeah, so I would say most, if you looked at the teams that submitted, most of them came from probably the United States and Europe had the largest representation. But we also saw Japan, South Korea, some Asian countries. There were a couple of Chinese researchers who were on some of the teams. China also hosted a workshop in the field PQ Crypto a couple of years back. So they've been participating to some degree. On the other hand, it's unlikely that they'll follow what we end up standardizing. And in fact, China did their own internal PQC standardization process to select their own algorithms that China will use. So they do have researchers in the field that are participating in an academic sense, but in terms of standardization, kind of are on different paths.
Now, that's really interesting because that's, of course, one of the big questions is the divergence in the standards world and whether there'll be 2 independent systems. Ben, when you hear this, what do you think the implications are for cybersecurity, both of having the Chinese not involved and in the progress we're making towards developing post-quantum cryptography? This is very similar in some ways to the path that the US took in the 1990s with the development of PKI and other forms of encryption to secure the newly commercial internet. And that was a multi-year process. So, and where we still experience some of the exciting moments because of adoption, slow adoption rates. What's your take on the implications?
I would initially look at how previously, like if we look at like RussiaNet or ChinaNet, they've already historically implemented their own versions of cryptography. Like if we look at like the Zuck cryptography in China, or I can't remember the name of it because I never really touched it, but there's a specific Russian cryptography algorithm that you don't really see standardized or used outside of their region. And I would expect the same to happen with the post-quantum cryptography. I believe I've seen one small deviation, and that the German government, the BIS, did start, I think, some approving of McElis, even though I don't think that has officially been approved yet on the NIST side.
And maybe just to comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the German government, we've talked with them, and they're interested in some of the more conservative algorithms, and so they're interested in an algorithm called Classic McLeese, which is still in our 4th round, and they're also interested in an algorithm called Frodo, which we did not select for standardization.
Well, it's a great name nonetheless, but and we should point out that Zuck is not an homage to the owner of Facebook, but Celia, let me turn to you, because I think one of the topics we hope to talk about today is public-private collaboration in the use of and commercialization of quantum technologies, but also in the adoption of secure quantum technologies. So what do you see happening in that front? Do you see, I know there's a lot of interest, and we can turn to Ben and Dustin with the same question afterwards, but where are the areas where you think they're the sweet spots for collaboration here?
Well, thanks, Jim. I see a lot of interest among QED-C members, which covers the whole spectrum of parts of the ecosystem and participants and stakeholders, right? So it includes the quantum computing makers, but also the end users and those who are trying to make sure that the threats are mitigated and that there's an efficient uptake of new standards as they become available. Actually, QED-C put out a guide for quantum safe organizations that gave some pretty accessible and actionable recommendations, similar to those that were outlined to the government agencies in the National Security Memorandum, which we may touch upon later. So there are some common sense approaches that can be taken now to be prepared. And QED-C is an organization that is independent. We're a non-government entity. We do get some government support, but we're really supported by the community of our members to achieve the goal of realizing the benefits of quantum information science and technology. And so at the same time as we want to accelerate progress towards the useful applications, we want to recognize and help to address the downsides, like the one that we've been talking about. Some of the members of QED-C have roles to play in the provision of solutions. And I do, sort of as a private citizen, I guess, want to understand and hope that the government is asking, how can we be more efficient? What have we learned from previous updates in cryptographic standards? Why does it take so long? Is it because of embedded systems? Is it because small businesses don't have the wherewithal? What are the bottlenecks that keep things from happening as quickly as they could, perhaps? And what can we do to remove those bottlenecks, perhaps? And QED-C would be very interested in being part of that kind of solution as well.
Well, that wasn't going to be my next question, but I think it's useful to touch on, because one of the things that we've talked about in some of the earlier episodes of this panel series is the timeline for adoption and why that may be slow, why we might need to accelerate it. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts on what are the obstacles here. I would have picked embedded systems. You know, that's in the past always been an issue, that you have programs that have been around in some cases for a long time. They are based on cryptography that, you know, was current at the time, but may no longer be current. But there could be other reasons, workforce, skills. What's the view here from all three of you on, and maybe we'll start with Dustin. Why do you think there's a lag sometimes in adoption of this? And it would be silly to think it would be immediate, but what do you think here are the things that slow adoption?
Yeah, we certainly want to encourage a fast transition, but we've seen historically just transitions from one cryptographic algorithm to another are just, they often can take 10, 15 years, even longer. I think embedded systems are one thing. People are using something, they're reluctant to change, they don't want to take more money, more time, resources that they have to switch out an algorithm for something new. Some of these algorithms for post-quantum are going to be a little bit more mathematically involved, and usually your IT people don't have to get into the weeds so much, but these are going to be a little bit more complicated than RSA, where we just had to deal with multiplying numbers and factoring, and some of these algorithms had things like decryption failures that we haven't had to deal with before. So there will be potentially some complexities. I'm not sure exactly why it can't go a lot faster. We know it takes time, it takes people planning, and we're encouraging people to look ahead and to prepare and plan. But embedded systems would probably be my number one reason that it just doesn't happen as quick as we'd like.
Ben, what's your take on this? What do you see when you talk to people in the market?
I mean, traditionally, people don't really care about these things until they see like their neighbor's house burn down. It's really, sometimes you have to have an attack happen or a major breach, and then that triggers actions. But I would recommend organizations do start planning and actually testing, right? Now that one of those finalists, like such as Kyber, has been announced by NIST, I would recommend organizations start testing. Like, hey, let me take some of those embedded systems and actually install this cryptography suite and see what happens. So then you can provide those comments when they do the feedback request.
Mm-hmm.
Celia, what do you see in the market? I mean, do you see people coming up with ways to test? Is it sandboxes? I mean, what are companies doing? What are your members doing?
Yeah, I haven't yet. I think there will be a sort of cottage industry around that when the time comes. And it could get started now so that people can plan. I mean, sometimes I think people also discount the value of information on certain systems. Maybe they think I don't need to bother with systems because the information doesn't need to be protected for that long. And I'm betting that, the threat will be out, beyond that time horizon, which is a risk calculation. I mean, I think you can't assume it's not realistic to expect every system to be fully migrated. A company has to prioritize and decide where the biggest risks lie and address those first. So I think that's a reasonable approach, and having help to do that and incentives perhaps from policymakers would go a long way, I think.
So what's the market going to look like? Will it be people offering replacement encryption programs that are quantum proof? Will it be updates? Will it be homebrew? It's currently a mix when you look at.
Yeah, I think it will be all of the above. And
okay.
and when anything is a new product, there's a certain buyer beware that needs to be kept in mind. And even today, there are products advertised as being somehow quantum ready or giving you some kind of quantum proof capabilities, which may not be real. So I think there is a little bit of caution that the people who are looking for that kind of product need to keep in mind.
Shocking that the advertising would get ahead of the product. Well, I don't think we've ever heard that before. Ben, when you talk to your clients, what do you tell them the threats are? What do you tell them is on the horizon that they ought to be thinking about?
So obviously the quantum threat that's already been mentioned, but like I tell them it's not just limited to Shors and Grovers. Shors being the actual period finding function that helps us do the factoring, but there's likely going to be future quantum algorithms that are going to be discovered, right? There's going to be smarter people or more people who suddenly get eureka insights, and they're going to discover new algorithms. And those new algorithms may be something like a lattice reduction attack or something like this that attacks and breaks these post-quantum algorithms, which, you know, we don't want to happen, but it could. So preparing for cascades of failures of these potential options in the future means not just looking at RSA or elliptical curve or discrete log is what to worry about, but there could be a lot of threats, and preparing for the ability to quickly adapt to those different threats as they emerge and respond and upgrade or change. That's going to be a management problem in itself, and preparing for that management problem rather than a specific threat is a strategy to mitigate that risk.
Dustin, do you think that that would imply you're in a dynamic process, that you aren't, it's not one and done, that you're going to have more work in front of you? Is that how you're approaching it?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with what Ben said. A term we use to describe that is crypto agility, where we want you to be able to switch out what you're using for something else. As he said, new attacks could be discovered. We've standardized the first algorithms, but yeah, there could be hiccups along the way. We will standardize more algorithms in the future, depending on the research that happens, the results that comes in. So we certainly hope and expect the algorithms we picked will begin to be used, and hopefully for a long time, but we will be prepared, for whatever the future holds, so that we'll be able to keep our information safe.
Celia, we focused a lot on cryptography and computing, but are there other quantum applications that we ought to be thinking about in this security context? I say this because I just got a whole series of lectures about I'm not paying enough attention to sensing. So when you think about the applications, what are the ones, rank them for us in terms of risk maybe, or likely adoption, and the two are related?
Well, I think that in terms of adoption, sensing is an area that is in all likelihood nearer term, or even arguably already here. There are quantum-based sensors available on the market. I think over time they will become more robust and affordable as the markets grow, or in the other order perhaps. And a sensor needs to be connected. You need to get the data out and you need to do something with that data. And so there's a networking of sensors. The networking may be more classical in nature, or it could also be quantum in nature. So there's a lot of networking of either computers or sensors or other types of objects that's likely to happen in the future. And security of all of those will be important. I think that there's some sense that quantum offers improved security in some of its applications. And that sort of is the other side of the coin in a way. We're talking about classical systems and the threat that quantum poses to those classical systems. But in the future, there may be more security that is the result of quantum aspects of information collection and distribution and storage and so on. So I think that's farther in the future, possibly farther even than the quantum computing that will pose the threats we're talking about, but ultimately would be an upside of the quantum revolution that we're seeing. And in terms of the risks to sort of security of sensors, again, it's somewhat perhaps traditional. I think there are challenges in network systems today that are difficult to protect from certain threats and probing and exfiltration of information. And there are technologies like quantum key distribution that may provide some value in certain application areas. It's not a panacea, but it's a technology that's in the toolkit for some users to take advantage of.
So you said one word that immediately made me perk up, which is hybrid systems. And so I'd like to ask all of you this. That I hear from some companies that you're going to see a blend eventually of quantum technologies and conventional technologies. And of course, from an intelligence point of view, it's those seams between two technologies that offer you a real opportunity, right? So what do you think about telling companies in terms of how to manage the hybrid environment, which is probably how likely do you think it is? What's it going to look like? Because I'm sure countries around the world are looking at the seams as an avenue for quick exploitation. But what's your take? Ben, why don't we start with you on the hybrid environment?
Yeah. So in fact, most quantum technology is going to be hybrid. We need classical or our normal binary computers to read out, control, or manage the actual quantum systems. To give an example of a hybrid quantum system is like quantum key distribution, right? So the fiber channel and the polarized photons or the entangled photons going across that is definitely quantum mechanical in nature. But the endpoints that are conducting the basis measurements and collecting those readouts of those polarized photons as bits, they eventually have to come back to classical bits. That's the weak point I think adversaries would target. If they know that quantum mechanics says if I try to peak the photons here in the middle, it's going to break the protocol like BB84 or E91. But if I peak it on the hard drive after it's been measured, now that's perfectly fine. That's where adversaries are going to attack, the weakest spot. And for most of these hybrid systems, the classic system is going to be the weak spot. So,
Dustin, how did this affect your thinking?
Yeah, so when you say hybrid, there's more than one type of hybrid involved. Sure. And combining classical with QKD or quantum is one form of hybrid. In the field of post-quantum cryptography, there's a lot of discussion in hybrid in terms of combining a post-quantum algorithm with a currently implemented standardized algorithm. And there's a lot of discussion about that. It certainly makes sense to combine algorithms, especially when these new post-quantum ones are newer, until we get a little bit more confidence, a little bit more experience in how to use them. If done appropriately, if done correctly, you're in the best of both worlds in terms of you won't break the hybrid combination unless you can break each individual piece. You do pay a performance penalty, and in some areas that performance penalty, you might not want to do that. But it certainly makes sense to us that, and we've heard a lot of interest from industry, that they expect to transition to the future in a hybrid way where they'll be implementing more than one crypto system. That could also involve quantum cryptographic or QKD as part of that as well. It needs to be done carefully because if done incorrectly, you end up doing some negotiation between different cipher suites, and you can cause attacks to occur that way. So it has to be done carefully, but it can be. And we think that it's very likely that we will see kind of hybrid implementations of cryptography as we transition to the future.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Celia, what are you hearing from your members?
I think it's consistent with what the other panelists have indicated. It's an area where you do need to be very careful. I think that while there are weaknesses and vulnerabilities kind of in any approach, it doesn't mean you shouldn't, raise the bar in one area. Dustin used the term crypto agility. Sometimes whack-a-mole seems like the more realistic term. You kind of press, take care of a problem over here, and then something pops up somewhere else because that's where the weakest link is now. And so you want to kind of keep ratcheting up all those different parts of the system so that you maximize protection without overburdening the system, right? You can spend all your time putting locks on all the doors and windows, and then you can't interact with the world at all. Doesn't work very well either.
I want to get back to the market for this stuff, and maybe we'll start by asking Dustin about the profile of the submitters to the competition. How many were academic? How many were big? How many were small? How many were commercial entities, or was it all academic? What does it look like? Because that's a hint about the market.
Yeah, so I think we had close to 300 different submitters that were involved in all the different teams. I can't name a percentage off the top of my head, but I would say, I guess, probably 75% were academic. But there was a significant portion as well that were researchers that are working for various companies. After we made our announcement of the selected algorithms, we saw that, in fact, several companies were like, this was our algorithm that won. And it wasn't that the company itself submitted it, but they had researchers on the teams. Those industry right now tend to be kind of bigger players, the Google, Microsoft, IBMs, these big companies. And they're definitely participating in the process. They've given us lots of feedback. And we hope to see some smaller organizations as well. And we've given lots of talks and so on to make sure awareness is out there. But the bigger players are certainly involved in the process.
Ben, what does the market look like to you in terms of, this is we're on the supply side now. It's the people who will be supplying the cryptography that companies will eventually need. We hope they'll adopt, or they might have a big surprise if they don't. What does the market look like to you?
Well, we have seen some of these people who submitted these algorithms have their own companies now, which are positioning themselves to be that crypto agility platform and accelerator, where they help clients scan their environment for what kind of cryptography suites do you have installed currently? What do you currently have in your network flowing across endpoints with sensors? Then they also can have a platform to manage the removal and reissue or revocation of like keys or certificates in your environment. And they're really basing that off of their expertise of being able to submit an algorithm to NIST, and that makes them normally cryptography experts, so that they're pretty helpful at being able to do that whole process, because it's a management cycle of reissuing and doing all these things.
Celia, what's the profile of your membership? It's mainly companies, right? But are they big or little, or what does it look like?
Yes, it's about 3/4 corporate. The rest are a mix of universities and national labs and others. And among the corporate members, I would estimate roughly 3/4 or maybe more are small businesses. So while all the big companies that are in the quantum space are among our members, if you go and it's all on our website, the membership, predominantly small companies. And I think that, and they're a mix too of suppliers, software, all kinds. Some are companies that have filled a niche for a long time, and they're, for-profit going concerns making specialty electronics or something, lasers, etc. Some are startups and are still pre-revenue, so it's a big mix.
I forgot to say that we'll be able to take a few questions from the audience, and it turns out I'm late because we've already gotten one. So it's a good one and it fits into our discussion. Let me start with it. And maybe all three of you can chime in on it. They ask, what is needed for quantum agility? Is the first step to survey where public key encryption is in government and private systems? So that's really two questions. What do we need to do to get quantum agility, and what is quantum agility? Crypto agility, I beg your pardon. What does crypto agility look like or entail? Dustin, do you want to start?
Sure. So the way I usually think of crypto agility is the ability to easily swap out the cryptography you're using and replace it with something else. And we're talking about it in the context of transitioning to post-quantum cryptography, but it's a good principle to have in general anyway. With the crypto we're using now, there could be an attack and you'd want to switch it out for something else. So there's lots of different pieces to it. Good first step, is looking at the cryptography you're using now. Look at what information you have that's protected by cryptography. Is that cryptography public key? Is it symmetric key? As well as understanding, what risk are you willing to tolerate? how long does the information you have need to be protected? What's its information shelf life? And starting to just make a plan for transitioning, make sure someone's in charge of that plan, make sure IT staff is aware of this transition, start testing out various products, make sure your vendors are aware. These are all things that kind of can help you be a little bit more crypto agile as you take steps.
Great. Ben, when we say crypto agile, what do you think?
I would say exactly what Dustin said. But I would, the way the question was posed, if I heard it right, quantum agility. I would still surmise that they were meaning crypto agility, but it's interesting to think of the question as, well, what am I being agile from? I'm being agile from the quantum threat. What I like to think about this in maybe other dimensions. If you can always try to run faster than that threat, but there's ways to move laterally, or maybe if I could fly, right, that would also avoid the threat. So one of the key things to remember about this whole process in Shor's, the threat of Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm needs to see that key, right, before it can factor it. If the adversary is on your wires or on your interfaces and all they're seeing is encrypted traffic and they never saw the initial public key exchange, then they have nothing to factor. And that's an interesting weakness of Shor's, right? So we are seeing some clients starting to explore, like, well, how could I pre-share through a trusted channel or covert channel or out of bounds channel, a symmetric key, and then establish a tunnel between this other point. And then because the key is delivered through this other means where the adversary wouldn't have seen it, now it's just a flow of encrypted traffic that Shor's can't attack. And that's thinking about different ways like that is another way to stay agile, right?
Celia, what are you thinking on that? What are you thinking on this? And I do want to come back to key distribution because that's one of the, it's a traditional vulnerability, and it's also something that comes up as we see this quantum transition. But what are you hearing, Helen? What are you hearing, Celia?
Well, the only thing I wanted to add to what Dustin and Ben have already said is that I think we need to remember that it's not just big institutions that have really strong capabilities in-house. Financial sector is probably going to be pretty nimble in this area, for instance. Maybe some big medical data, organizations or something. But really, this is a problem that touches pretty much everyone, every business, and maybe even every individual at some point. And so how to kind of get those endpoints protected is, I think, the tougher question. And for small businesses that have one person on staff whose job it is to make sure the systems are secure, they just need to know kind of the questions to ask their provider. And they should be asking those questions now, which I think Dustin sort of alluded to. But I think equipping people so their eyes are open and they know some of the questions to ask. They may not be the ones who actually implement the solution themselves, but they have a responsibility and a role in their organization. And there are many, many more organizations like that really out there that need to be getting ready.
If I remember correctly, it took a while to develop secure key distribution systems in the sort of first phase of connectivity. Does quantum pose any special problems when it comes to key distribution? Are there special things we'll need to take into account, or is it just retreading the path that we took before? And all of you can answer that, or not, as the case may be.
Well, I'll try first. I'd say we've learned some things in the past from crypto transition. So there are lessons that we have learned, but there's going to be new things that are new because we're using new crypto systems, we're using new math. So in one sense, these algorithms they're going to be implemented on classical machines. They are cryptographic algorithms. So we're familiar with how a digital signature works, with how a public key encryption algorithm works. So we should be able to handle that. But yeah, I'm sure there will be unexpected things that crop up. For example, the algorithms we've selected have larger key sizes than we're used to. Public key sizes, ciphertext sizes, signature sizes. So as they're put into place in different applications and protocols, it might turn out they're too big for what they have previously used. And so there will have to be some changes made. So looking ahead for things like that, that's part of the planning that you can be doing to make sure that everything will work.
Ben, you want to add anything to that?
And we're talking about just, did you say quantum key, the distribution of keys, or
Yeah.
specifically on?
You remember the old, what was it, Bob and Alice scenarios that we had to memorize? What does that look like in a quantum world?
And so in a quantum world, I think there's some new problems that perhaps I haven't seen much attention to. So, and a lot of these, right, like Alice and Bob, like Alice picks P and Bob picks Q, and they pick the Toycian function to get their co-primes or whatever. Those initial selection of like P and Q for or whatever you want for your cryptography is normally the result of some kind of randomness, right? Like entropy. There may be some threats in the future, right? We're starting to see some quantum machine learning or other kinds of like Grovers, where perhaps they may be able to effectively search for what randomness seed you started with, or what that, to me, that's an interesting problem to look at. That even if we have a very strong math, and if the lattice math turns out to be really strong, if an adversary can still predict what was the random seed or cryptographic material that you used to generate the lattice encoding, then it's weakened your cryptography between Alice and Bob. There's some other things too when we look at like hashing. So a lot of the times there's like an HMAC where the key and a message and something else is hashed as part of the cryptography process. I think there's some interesting look at how perhaps these new hash algorithms that have the extendable output function, at how perhaps those could be leveraged in new ways to defeat like a hybrid Grover rainbow table attack, where I'm trying to make the search space prohibitively large for even a combination of some kind of future supercomputer and some kind of future quantum supercomputer. Those combined together, I could still make that search space prohibitively large for them to discover. I think there's some interesting attacks when you start thinking about just like, just the combination of quantum and normal high performance supercomputers, those combined together. And if there's assumptions we're making on what has traditionally been safe, other than just this specific math problem.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the Chinese didn't enter one of their most powerful computers in the top 500 computer contest last year. And those with suspicious minds might be concerned by that. So I wouldn't want to underestimate how far they've come in high performance computing. But we got it. Speaking of which, we've gotten another question. We've a couple questions queued up. This question is, how do we keep China from harvesting data and encrypting in the future? And I'll rephrase it a little bit, is can we keep China from harvesting data and decrypting it in the future? There might be ways to do this. I don't know who wants to start. Dustin, Celia, do you want to, how do we manage the Chinese issue in this world of cybersecurity?
That's a tough one. I'm a mathematician. I don't want to go too much above my level. How to stop China from doing that? I will say public key cryptography is designed with the idea that your adversary knows exactly how the algorithm works, and they can have access to the encrypted data, and they still can't break it. So that's part of the kind of the foundations of cryptography is assuming that they will have access to it, and you can still provide security. That said, the more access they get to it, the better they can develop attacks and find cracks. So yeah, that's an excellent question.
Anyone else on that one? I tend to assume. Ben, go ahead.
I mean, there's a lot of tricky things you could do, but I would say those tricky things would primarily be between maybe your like headquarters and your disaster recovery site or sister headquarters in another country, where you have these point to point, again, like Alice and Bob. There is tricky things you could do. Perhaps you could treat it almost like noise, like a signal, where every other bit I'm injecting like a random bit. So then the other side knows to take one and skip one. But an adversary in the middle may not know that I'm using some kind of signaling protocol mixed in with normal encryption. I mean, that's kind of paranoid stuff and normally a bit over the top, but there are countermeasures you could do, right? But those typically require strategic planning and design.
I guess I would just kind of shine a light on the other end of the spectrum a little bit, and that is whereas a smart, well-resourced threat may have no trouble getting access to information, you don't have to make it any easier than it is. And so just some basic good practices would perhaps thwart and make it less easy. So I think just normal good behavior, and I think we've seen over and over that human engineering is sometimes the easiest way to get information. So again, training your workforce not to do things that are really avoidable is a good start.
I'm still upset about the email I got that said I'd won the Irish sweepstakes. If only I'd provide them with my personal data. Very upsetting. Celia, let's continue with you because we have 4 questions in the queue, and I think we have enough time to hit them all. But somebody asked, are there any actually successful e.g. profitable KQD business models? What are you seeing in the consortium?
I think that there's more widespread adoption outside the U.S. for various reasons, and there are these sort of within an organization applications that have been made, sort of similar to what Ben was referring to. So point-to-point security and sort of local area net security approaches. There are interesting experiments being done, and I think that we'll learn from those. So I don't think they're without merit. They, are being done by people who are pretty smart and hopefully are being transparent about what the capabilities are. But I think that there certainly are experiments being done that are very interesting and may prove to be quite useful.
So I take experiments as meaning that nobody's figured out how to make a profit yet out of this, or is that a bit too?
I don't know. I mean, people are doing, sort of consulting and small sandbox experiments. They may not scale yet, but I think it remains to be seen. I mean, most quantum application markets are still primarily in the future. But again, QKD is a more mature technology that's been around somewhat longer. So it's a little farther along in terms of those demonstrations.
If you like history, when the Y2K concern arose, God, at this point, more than 20 years ago, they stuck them in an office over on I Street. And there was discussion recently about whether they should put the National Cyber Director in the same office, which would have been a nice historical touch. But I asked that because one of the questions we got is, how similar is this to the Y2K effort? And in what ways is it not like Y2K? And that was from the American Bankers Association. So Y2K, similar, not similar? What do you think there?
Well, Y2K had a specific time and date attached where we knew something was going to happen. We don't have a concrete deadline or date like that with when quantum computers will be here or a big enough quantum computer to attack crypto system. So that's one difference. On the other hand, it is a very important thing that can't be overlooked, or you could be vulnerable to attacks that would expose your data. So it's different in some ways, but it is a important threat, an important transition that we will all have to take into account.
I think on that point, I will say that this is a really common question. You know, when is that Q2K thing going to be? And while we don't know when, there are signals that we can watch that that progress is being made. The first quantum computers that are going to be available, even ones for something kind of commercially useful and practical, may not be sufficient to implement the algorithms that are going to be a real threat that we're talking about here today. And so you'll be able to sort of see that progress happening. There may be quantum leaps along the way, but things like error correction technologies or techniques, scaling up of the sort of size and performance as reported by various metrics, these are all things that you can watch for along the way. So it won't be like you wake up one day and all of a sudden there's this powerful quantum computer.
This always happens, but at the end we get a flood of questions. So I'm going to do a couple of them. We'll see how much time we have. We could save time if Dustin chose to answer this as a yes or no question, but that may not placate the audience. Is NIST planning on standardizing crypto agility or quantum classical hybrid systems?
I don't think we're planning on standardizing a hybrid mode because it's going to depend very much on the application for how you combine two different crypto systems and where you're doing it. So we're facilitating the conversation around hybrid and making sure people know the pros and cons, but it's not something that's likely going to be in a standard, no.
Okay. Another question. What innovations do we need from the private sector to move this along? Celia, I don't know if you want to start with that one.
Well, I mean, I think it's a combination of the sort of ability to make the transition happen smoothly. At the same time, I mean, no one is seriously saying we shouldn't proceed with developing quantum computers. I think it's important as part of this conversation to point out to the audience that there are going to be many benefits from the capability of these systems. So it's worth taking the steps to protect ourselves from these risks and threats. And there will be roles to play by many different parts of the ecosystem. So stay tuned. I guess there's all those parts are represented at QED-C.
What are the innovations you're seeing among your members that you think are most interesting? I mean, and this could be commercial application, it could be sensing, it could be something else. What's the most interesting parts of the market for you right now?
Boy, that's like picking my favorite child. I don't know if I'm willing to do that, but
you can have two favorite children.
I have recently had the chance to visit some members when I was out on the West Coast, and I was really excited to see some of the sensing applications that are moving forward. And some of the small companies are doing very exciting, innovative things, and they don't have, big marketing machines. And so they're not as well known. So, that's one of the things that QED-C is trying to help do, is shine a light on some of these capabilities. So I look forward to sharing more through various QED-C outlets on some of our members. Go to the Quantum Marketplace, for instance, to learn more. We just had one on what's going on in cryogenics, which is an enabling technology, really important. And a lot of exciting things are happening in that space. So there's just a whole, the enabling technologies are coming as well as the quantum systems.
And Ben, I think you mentioned quantum machine learning. I can't read my notes necessarily, but what does that look like? How's that going to change the machine learning or AI landscape?
It's going to be, there's a combination, right, where you're either pre-encoding the qubits with certain information and then running operations on them and then measuring it and then returning back to, if you're like in a neural network or something, or it is a combination where it's recycling. I would suggest like looking at Google's Quantum TensorFlow, and that's like reading their guide if you're more interested in quantum machine learning. But if quantum machine learning, achieves some of the interesting things it can do, it may enable better machine learning, not just of other classification tasks, but of quantum itself. And that could enable perhaps better quantum error correction or other scientific breakthroughs. I'm not sure. It's really speculative at this point.
Speculation are us. So,
Okay.
Dustin, did this come up in the contest at all, or how are you thinking about it when you look ahead?
It didn't too much, I'd say, appear in our process. I have seen a recent paper that uses some techniques of AI and machine learning where they're able to do some interesting things cryptographically, but it's still, I'd say, pretty cutting edge right now. It hasn't made a lot of concrete results yet.
Okay, last question, and I think in some ways we're going to start with Celia because this is squarely in her wheelhouse, as the cliche goes. But what is needed to support the deployment and adoption of quantum technologies? What roles do agencies play in quantum adoption? So you've done this before with other technologies. What would you suggest?
So I think there's probably, and I wish you had given us this question so I could have a nice 3-point checklist, but
Actually,
I will say,
we did.
Okay, well, so number one.
So just proving that no one ever reads my emails, but anyhow.
Clearly, well, there's been several panels since then.
Yeah, sure.
Number one, I think the government always has the opportunity to be an early adopter, an early customer, and certainly in sensing applications that's possible in defense systems, for instance. There's a program called Quest, which is moving its way through. It's been authorized and hopefully will be appropriated, that would devote some government funds to cover the cost for researchers from industry, the private sector, or from academia or national labs to actually use quantum computers. So that's a bit of a moving target today. Giving a researcher access to a quantum computer doesn't really give them that much power, but over time it will improve. And so having a program where you help support the access to quantum computing resources, I think, is another example. And I'll close with a call for workforce development, which investing in research is essentially investing in workforce development at the graduate level, certainly, and to some extent at the undergraduate level, but we need technicians and sort of all types of workers in this field. So there's a lot to be done. Most of my members say their sort of number one thing that keeps them up at night is finding talented people to come and work for their companies.
Ben, you also worked for several agencies. When you think about federal support for deployment and adoption, what would you recommend?
I got a 3-point plan. The first one definitely is also the workforce development. I would love to see more linear algebra and matrix math rather than having to learn calculus. 2, infrastructure. There's this concept or vision called the quantum internet, and I believe the Department of Energy is already working on that. And that's something I think the government could definitely help with. And then 3, security standards. And I don't just mean post-quantum or the cryptography, but like looking at like the history of the internet. Like when we first built internet or computers, the people developing it weren't necessarily thinking of security. And we've spent, like the past how many decades trying to patch all the holes. And it's easier to secure things when that security is built in from the beginning. So that's what I would love to see.
Dustin, last word. Almost the last word.
This has been a good conversation. I thank you for it. I'd encourage people to make sure you're aware of the coming transition and what you can do to prepare. QED-C's put out good information. NIST also has our National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence that is teaming up with private organizations to develop playbooks and give out guidance as well. So I'd encourage you to look for information there as well. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk today.
Great. The one thing we didn't talk about because it's so speculative is technological surprise. And I usually don't worry a lot about that, but I think quantum cryptography, quantum decryption is one area where technological surprise is a real risk. So we covered a lot of ground. Celia, Ben, I don't know if you have any final remarks. Good conversation if you don't, but
Thank
please
you.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this has been really helpful, I hope, to the audience members. And I make myself available to anyone who has questions or wants to be connected to an expert, because I think within QED-C we have a lot of outstanding expertise.
Great. Ben, any final thoughts?
No.
Okay. Well, this, I don't know if this was comforting or I actually found this conversation comforting. I mean, Ben, having been sort of midpoint in the development of the internet commercially, we're actually ahead of where we were, say, 25 years ago with when the Clinton administration commercialized it. And so I think that's where, looking at like what Dustin is doing, looking at what Celia is doing, we didn't have those efforts underway. I'll tell Dustin a joke about elliptic curve cryptography later. But a lot of work to do. Thank you for a really deep conversation, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks a lot.